Welcome to the Wednesday Yachting Luncheon, live from the virtual grill room of the St. Francis Yacht Club. We look forward to seeing you back in the Yacht Club just as soon as conditions permit, but in the meantime, we hope that you are safe and sound in a thoughtful, sheltered environment, and we're happy to be bringing to you speakers from around the world who've got something to say on thoughtful issues. We've had naval scholars and admirals, etc., talk to us about the danger of fighting the next war's battles with the last war's weapons. Our speaker today can speak to that very issue. Born in New Jersey, she graduated from Bryn Mawr in Russian and poli-sci, went on to Georgetown to get a degree in Russian. She in fact does speak Russian, Ukrainian, and some Polish, as well as, of course, English. She is a Fulbright Clinton, and that's not named after Bill, but rather Hillary Clinton, a scholar at the Wilson Center. She's written a fascinating book on how to lose the information war, and we are very pleased to welcome a thoughtful journalist who's been quoted in the New York Times and the Washington Post and in the Atlantic, and who has important and significant things to say. So Nina Jankowicz, welcome to the Wednesday Yachting Luncheon.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be with you. Well, as was in my introduction, my book is called How to Lose the Information War. And I came up with the idea for the book when I was living in Ukraine as part of the Fulbright Fellowship that I did. I was advising the Ukrainian Foreign Ministry on strategic communications, and they are very much on the front line of the information war. And that was during 2016 and 2017 when, so many revelations about foreign interference in US elections were coming out, and watching all of that unfold from Kiev, the capital of Ukraine, really gave me an interesting perspective and made me think that for a very long time, the United States and our kind of old Western allies, the UK, et cetera, have been really ignoring the experiences of our allies in Central and Eastern Europe. And that's what the book tries to bring to bear. A little bit more about me. At the Wilson Center, I lead a rigorous research program focused on both policy development and building practical awareness within the general public of the tools and tactics of disinformation. That means doing congressional testimonies and briefings. I've testified before the Senate Judiciary Committee and the House Appropriations Committee. And I also organize and speak at conferences and do a lot of cross-border engagement with other governments that are working on these issues. The Wilson Center, of course, is a nonpartisan policy think tank that is congressionally endowed in part. It is the nation's living memorial to President Woodrow Wilson, who was the only president with a PhD. So we're very focused on scholarship at the Wilson Center. And soon I'm going to have a new paper out about comparative approaches to social media regulation around the world. I think, again, our US Congress could stand to learn from those who have gone before us, and that's generally the way that I like to do my work. So this is one of my favorite little images, and I think it really represents how so far we have been fighting the information war. I call it whack-a-troll, very much like the carnival game of whack-a-mole. Rather than a holistic strategy for countering disinformation, we have been very focused on fact-checking and removing malign content, rather than creating a whole of government, whole of society response to the problem. And the case studies that I go over in my book really show that that's necessary and that we need vision from the very top of government in order to achieve that. Before we go on too much further, I always like to set terms because, especially in the disinformation world, people tend to use these terms fairly interchangeably, and that is not very good when we're talking about things that are extremely nuanced. So disinformation is the use of false or misleading information spread with malign intent. So that is what Russia is doing, perhaps what China is doing. It can be within the confines of the United States as well, within our own borders. There is domestic disinformation. We also have misinformation, which is false or misleading information spread without malign intent. And that I usually give the example of our crazy aunt or uncle at the Thanksgiving dinner table who likes to bring up those conspiracy theories. They're misinformed, not disinformed. Then we have propaganda, which is probably quite a familiar term. The difference between propaganda and disinformation that we're seeing today is that propaganda usually pushes a specific ideology or worldview. So the stuff that China is doing today, actually, amid the COVID-19 pandemic, attempting to cast China's response in a positive light and denigrate the US response, that's more on the propaganda realm. But what Russia does is actually use pre-existing fissures in our society on all sides of the political spectrum to pit Americans against one another. And that's the difference between propaganda and disinformation. Disinformation doesn't have those same political scruples behind it. And then just for fun, because these are often, again, used interchangeably without much meaning, the difference between a troll and a bot. You might have heard of the Troll Farm, the Internet Research Agency in St. Petersburg, Russia. A troll farm or a troll is an account that's actually controlled by a person. They might have multiple accounts, but there's a person behind that account. Whereas a bot is run through automated computer code. And basically that code tells different accounts to either tweet or post content, and it's usually the same content across many, many accounts. Both of these can be used to give the guise of grassroots support for an issue online. So I think it's very important that we use those terms correctly when we're speaking about them, particularly the difference between dis and misinformation, and that is intent. So I mentioned that Russian disinformation in particular exploits the trust gap that is kind of manipulating our emotions. Disinformation runs on emotion. And I just love this graph. This is from the Edelman Trust Barometer, which comes out every year and measures people's trust in business, media, NGOs, and government across a wide variety of countries. And I think it's just really instructive that in aggregate, from 2017 to 2018, the United States saw a 37% decline in trust in institutions just in that 1 year. And certainly during the COVID-19 pandemic, as concerns about voting and the election are raised, that trust is definitely wavering and, in my opinion, most likely plummeting in our democratic institutions right now. And that leaves us ripe for manipulation. So it's a very scary time to be holding an election because already we have a basis of uncertainty that bad actors like Russia can exploit. How does the influence playbook work, the online influence playbook? In Russia's playbook, they, as we know, use things like bot and troll armies to amplify misleading messages. They have used government-organized NGOs, or as we call them, gongos, that are kind of like fake front organizations to lend credence to the narratives that they are amplifying. The same thing with fake experts who will go on as talking heads to legitimize a narrative that they want to take hold on TV or be quoted in newspapers, these things. We have cyber attacks and cyber crime, which of course everyone is familiar with after the DNC hacks in 2016. We call this malinformation, so malign information that might not have been public but is shared with that malign intent. Those attacks are part and parcel of the disinformation playbook because of their provenance and the way that the media deals with them. They can be extremely harmful. And then, of course, we know that Russia has funded and organized both protests and political parties, not only here in the United States, but abroad. There has been funding for, the Alternative for Deutschland party in Germany, as well as a number of others in Italy and France. And we know in the United States, they've actually succeeded in getting protesters on the streets. So lest we think this is just something that happens online, disinformation and the influence playbook can affect behavior as well. But what's Russia's goal in all of this? Why is it going through all of this trouble? I think the goal is twofold. The first goal is to undermine the US democratic system so that we are consumed by our own problems, so that we're paying a lot less attention to what Russia is doing, be it in Ukraine, in Syria, in Venezuela, in the Central African Republic. We're consumed, so we're giving Russia a free pass for that sort of thing. But it also is beneficial to Putin himself because he can turn to protesters in his own country, as he's had throughout the entire summer, protesters in Khabarovsk, the far eastern city, every weekend, demanding a more democratic process for electing their governor, for example. And he can say to those protesters, do you really want democracy? Because look what's going on over in the United States, that shining city on a hill, which used to exemplify all of these things. Look at their protests, look at their internal division. And that benefits Putin at home because most Russians will choose order over freedom. because of the experiences they've had, and that's certainly being exploited by Russia. And then one final thing that I think ties both of the intermediary goals together, a greater goal, is that disinformation, by asserting Russian disinformation, by Russia asserting itself on the world stage, it kind of puffs Russia up to a previous greatness that it perhaps would not have right now in 2020. You know, the economic situation in Russia, the demographic situation in Russia is not very good. It is not certainly the world leader that the Soviet Union once was, and Putin wants to restore that greatness. And by meddling, he has kept Russia on the lips of Americans and many of our allies around the world almost every day for the past 4 years. So I think in that sense, these disinformation campaigns and influence campaigns have a huge return on investment. Social media, of course, play a very important role as well. Social media allow these narratives, whether they're coming from Russia, from China, or from domestic disinformers, to be targeted at exactly the right audiences that are going to be most vulnerable to them. That's why, you know, some of the similar Russian disinformation tactics that we saw during the Soviet Union, even the late Soviet era, did not gain the traction that they're gaining today, because today we are segmented by interest, by vulnerability, by demographics online. And Russia can very easily test these messages and hone in on the ones that are most compelling to its audience. So now I'll talk about a few of the case studies from the book that I think are most interesting and most connected to our experience here in the United States today. The first one is Estonia in 2007, which I view as kind of the beginning of the modern Russian disinformation campaign. Basically, Estonia, this small Baltic country, I'm sure they have some sailing there on the Baltic Sea. They've got about 1.3 million people, and after the Soviet Union fell, 30% of the population of Estonia was ethnic Russian. And those folks, unfortunately, were disenfranchised in many ways. Some of them didn't have citizenship because they didn't speak Estonian, and that was a requirement for citizenship. They had different sort of access, different and worse sort of access to jobs and education. They were even, to some degree, de facto ghettoized in where they lived in the country. And so there were real grievances in that society. And Putin looked at Estonia, which had joined NATO, joined the EU, and he said, how can I undermine this country? I'm going to drive home these ethnic divisions, ethnic and linguistic divisions. And this all came to a head around the bronze soldier who you see on the screen. This is a statue that used to stand in the middle of Tallinn, the capital of Estonia, and it marked a tomb of the unknown soldier and was a memorial to Soviet war dead. Of course, Estonians were not too fond of memorials to the Soviet Union, which famously oppressed many Estonians and sent them to gulags. And so this kind of became a flashpoint. It became a place where there were a lot of clashes between ethnic Estonians and ethnic Russians. And a new government decided they were going to move this statue to the outskirts of town, to a military cemetery. And this is the issue that Russian language media decided to drive home to the Russian population. It was the last straw. They said, look at how they treat you. Look at how they desecrate Soviet war dead who saved the world from fascism. Make sure you go out and claim your rights and show them what ethnic Russians can do in Estonia. And that led to riots. It led to one death. And Tallinn is usually a very sleepy city. So this is it's a big deal when this city is, engulfed in this sort of unrest. And as one of my interlocutors in the book told me, he was a journalist who actually had a flat overlooking the square that the statue stood in. He said, normally cameras follow events, but in this case with the Russian language media, events followed cameras. So basically they were staging these sorts of events. They were instigating protests. There is significant evidence of involvement of the Russian security services and the Russian embassy in antagonizing these protests. And to top it all off, there was also a cyber attack that affected Estonian government services, banks, and media. And this was a wake-up call for the Estonian government. They realized that they had a problem on their hands. They tried to ring the alarm bell for the West. Unfortunately, we didn't really take them seriously. We said, that might be something that you have to deal with, but Russia would never try that against the United States or Great Britain. And they continued to invest in kind of pushing back against Russia, increasing their cyber defenses. And then the annexation of Crimea happened, and the Estonians got nervous again and really doubled down on these efforts so that their population couldn't be divided anymore. And they worked on things like educational opportunities for the ethnic Russian population, more career opportunities, more integration, and also invested in Russian language media and media literacy programs. So looking inward and understanding what the fissures in our societies are that are being manipulated by bad actors is one of the keys across all of my case studies to solving the problem. This is a shot from a YouTube video that was part of a disinformation campaign that brings together Ukraine and the European Union. So it's a little bit complicated, but basically Ukraine, of course, had its revolution in 2014, its most recent revolution, the Euromaidan revolution. And this revolution happened because the former president, Viktor Yanukovych, decided to renege on an association agreement with the EU. The people of Ukraine were very upset about that. He fled the country. They elected a new leader, Petro Poroshenko, who was able to get an agreement. It had to be ratified by all the EU member states. And it was about to happen in the Netherlands, a famously Eurosceptic country, when a new constitutional referendum passed that allowed the citizens of the Netherlands to call to a referendum anything that Parliament was voting on. And so the far right and the far left of the Netherlands got together and said, we're going to call a referendum around this association agreement with Ukraine. Now, it's important to know a little bit of the context. Of course, the Dutch weren't very trusting of Ukraine because just a few years earlier in 2014, MH17, the plane shot down by Russian separatists over Ukraine, was filled with Dutch citizens. It originated in Amsterdam, so they were distrustful in that way, but they also really have a long-standing kind of Euroscepticism in the Netherlands, and they didn't want more European expansion. They didn't want, even though this is a misconception, the association agreement is an economic agreement, not a defense agreement. They didn't want Dutch soldiers, going to defend Ukraine. And Russia saw an opportunity here. This was not only an opportunity to undermine Ukraine's Euro-Atlantic aspirations, it was also an opportunity to undermine EU unity, which is something, of course, that Russia loves to do. So what did it do? It used information laundering to plant narratives, for instance, on Sputnik, their overt propaganda mechanism, that then made their way into the Dutch mainstream. It made YouTube videos like the one you see on the screen, where it had actors purporting to be Ukrainian terrorists who were threatening Dutch people if they didn't vote for the referendum. They sent fake Ukrainians to town hall meetings saying how corrupt Ukraine was and how Ukraine did not deserve to have this association agreement signed. And actually, it's pretty clear now that they sent some funding to some of the far left and far right parties in the Netherlands who were campaigning against the referendum. Ukraine tried its best to push back on all these narratives to kind of put a positive narrative forward about the referendum and about Ukraine, but that narrative was not able to gain nearly as much traction as the enraging content that Russia was seeding and that the folks who were organizing the referendum were in favor of. And that, to some degree has to do with social media. The most engaging content is the most enraging content. It's the most emotional content. And so the referendum failed. Ukraine was eventually granted its association agreement, but it had to find a diplomatic solution to it. And it wasn't the sign off and the jubilation that Ukraine had hoped for. And I think this is a really important lesson for the West, because often we hear, we just need to make the argument for democracy better. We just need to remind everyone why NATO is a good thing. But there's a reason that many people don't buy into these narratives to begin with. And that is much more deep-seated in, those societal fissures that Russia manipulates. And those are the things that we ultimately need to address if we're going to be more resilient societies overall. Ukraine is often a harbinger for the things that are going to happen here in the United States. Many of the tactics that were tested in Ukraine made their way here in 2016. And lo and behold, we are seeing very similar tactics taking place now. So I thought I'd give you kind of an update about what sorts of trends we're seeing in the disinformation space. And one of them is this fake local news push. So rather than creating a bot or a troll network to amplify information, one of the tactics Russia is using is creating fake local news websites in order to fill the gap that people are looking for. You know, local news is atrophying everywhere. They want a local lens on issues, and so they create little Facebook pages or websites that pretend to be legitimate local news outlets that actually redirect to things like RT or Sputnik. And here they're talking about water quality in the city of Zhytomyr in Ukraine. They've taken hundreds of inauthentic pages, groups, and accounts that use this trope down on Facebook since 2017. And of course, we've seen this happening here in the United States. Just a few weeks ago when we're recording this, so early September, we saw a takedown on Facebook of an operation called Peace Data that the Internet Research Agency was running. And they actually hired American freelance journalists to write articles posing as a left-leaning organization. This is a similar tactic, and it kind of is this information laundering thing that I was talking about before. Eventually, these narratives make their way into the mainstream, and that's exactly what Russia wants, because it gives them an air of plausible deniability, and people have their guard down when they're looking at things that are local. So it's something to keep your eye out for as we head toward the election. And also, you may be members of Facebook groups and other closed spaces online. This is a piece that I wrote in the summer with another disinformation researcher, Cindy Otis. She's a former CIA analyst. And both of us have been monitoring groups and how, because they are environments that people trust very highly, that is what makes them dangerous. They trust everything they see in there. Facebook is incentivizing engagement in groups, and often people are segmented by interest, as I was talking about before. So they might have, this is actually something that happened to me earlier this summer. I was researching folks who were involved in the anti-vaccination community. I saw an alternative health news group, and after looking at that, I was immediately recommended a QAnon conspiracy group, a white supremacist group, and another false flag conspiracy group. And that's the way Facebook's engagement algorithm works. So not only can you just easily drop a link to information that an audience is going to be vulnerable to, you're directed to other vulnerable audiences thanks to the platform. It's a very scary thing. Facebook knows it's a problem, but unfortunately has been reticent to take action because it benefits Facebook when people are engaged in these spaces. Another difficulty is that they are often closed. That means that researchers like me have a much more difficult time tracking the narratives that are there. And this is the same problem that we see with encrypted messengers like WhatsApp or Telegram, which haven't really taken off to the same degree in the United States yet, but they're difficult to track because they're private. And people can forward messages to large groups, and there's no real way to track it as it travels around throughout the internet. What are the key takeaways, though, of all these case studies that we've talked about today? And there are more in the book. I also talk about the Republic of Georgia, Poland, and the Czech Republic. It's really important to repair those fissures in society. And one way that we can do that is through media and digital literacy campaigns and civics. Both Ukraine and Estonia have invested in this, and they understand that the problems, their domestic problems, are being manipulated by foreign actors and by bad faith domestic actors, and that one of the ways that they can fill them back up, fill those gaps, is through these media and digital literacy campaigns, giving their citizens the tools that they need to navigate the online information environment. We also need to beware of vectors of homegrown disinformation. In the Netherlands example I gave, that was a key way that these disinformation narratives made their way into the discourse. And here in the United States, we have seen local activist groups being taken advantage of by foreign actors. I just talked about the freelance journalists who unwittingly were part of a Russian disinformation campaign. We need to also train our sights on homegrown disinformation, and that gets very sticky here in the United States because of our First Amendment, rightly so. But I think there is a misconception that disinformation is just something that happens over there, and really we're part of that ecosystem as well. So we need to be careful about that. And we also need our leaders to recognize that we cannot fight disinformation when we're practicing it ourselves. We could have the most airtight, counter Russian disinformation policy on the books done by our national security community. We could have the whole intelligence community behind us. But if political parties and politicians are sharing disinformation, then it undermines all of that and leaves us more vulnerable to future attacks. Here's just a quick checklist of things you can do. I always try to leave people with some actionable solutions because, especially with so little time left to the election, it's up to us now. Really think about when you are getting emotional in response to a piece of content you're encountering on the internet. That's a good indication that you might be being manipulated. So at that point, I like to say, practice informational distancing. Put your device down, walk away for a little bit, and then if it's still bothering you, check the source, see if it has contact info, see if the author has published other articles and if they're trustworthy or similarly kind of scary. Check the text itself. You can just copy and paste a little bit and put it in Google, and if other articles that are exactly the same come up that aren't from a wire service like Reuters or the AP, that's a really good indication that that's disinformation for profit, and that a network of sites has been created in order to generate clicks on ads. You can teach yourself how to do a reverse image search, which is a way basically you can right click on any image if you're using the Chrome browser, and it will take you to the earliest instance of that image on the internet. So here in Washington during hurricane season, we often have a fake picture of a shark swimming in the Potomac River. This would be an easy way to check and make sure that you understand that that image is actually faked. And in general, just practice social media skepticism. Cyber hygiene is also a really important part of this. Make sure you have two-factor authentication on all of your accounts, not just your bank accounts where you're forced to do it, but really important for your email. And most social media allow you to do this today as well. Basically, either inputting a digital code or having a physical security key that is your second authentication. That makes it almost impossible for malign actors to get access to your private information. And then really the easiest and best thing you can do to protect yourself online is to use a password manager like LastPass or 1Password. That basically all you'll ever have to do is remember one password for the rest of your life, and it will store and create complex passwords, and you never have to think about them. And that can also be protected by two-factor authentication. But those are two very easy things that I recommend everyone do. And this is just our cat again to remind us of where we came from and how far we have to go. We're still playing whack-a-troll right now, but it's up to us, up to our government to really implement a more holistic solution. And I always like to end with Thomas Jefferson, because I think this shows that this problem is not new. So Thomas Jefferson wrote in 1820, "I know of no safe depository of the ultimate powers of the society, but the people themselves. And if we think them not enlightened enough to exercise their control with a wholesome discretion, the remedy is not to take it from them, but to inform their discretion by education." And again, that gets back to the turning inward and the solving of our own societal fissures and not just playing whack-a-troll. And that is it for me. I would love it if you purchased my book. That's my information. If you'd like to get in touch, the Twitter handle is on top, and it's a delight to be with you.
Wonderful, terrific. Thank you very much, Nina. Great presentation, informative and thoughtful thesis, and we've been following it and what you said about it for months in the news since your book came out in July. A few questions. I've read that the Russian total military budget is a shockingly small number. The numbers that I learned are it's under 100 billion. It's something like 70 billion or so. First of all, what's your best estimate of Russian total military spending? And then what percent are these disinformation campaigns and or disinformation of total military spend?
That is a difficult question to answer. And in fact, I probably won't even endeavor to make a guess, because the interesting thing about the way that the Russian military and Russian intelligence services work is that they're incredibly secretive. So what's in the public budget is not necessarily what is actually being spent. And in fact, we have no idea how much the GRU, one of the intelligence units that is responsible for some of these disinformation campaigns. We have no idea how much they spend. It is a well-kept secret that budget is very large. We can say how much RT spends, and I think that their budget is something about $100 million per year, but RT is quite small compared to the, yeah. And the other thing is, you know, these campaigns aren't that expensive to run. We all heard the figure in 2016 that Russia spent $100,000 on ads. Like, that's not that much. And that's because they don't need to actually purchase very much to make these things go viral. You don't really need to spend money on ads if you know how to target different vulnerable communities with the tools that are already there. So, you know, the average internet research agency employee makes about $1,000 a month, which in St. Petersburg is actually quite good. They're usually, you know, university educated people with good English, other, you know, online skills. They're into pop culture and things like that. So they know how to target us. And that investment has really yielded dividends, as I said, for Putin in terms of raising the stature of the Russian Federation. And it's something that, you know, military reform, which the Russian army and armed services badly need. They need to be updated. That much has been clear for a very long time. That's a much longer project, and this has much higher returns in a much shorter period of time.
So while you might not know, can you best guess the size of the budget for the Internet Research Agency? Do you have any sense of it at all? You heard numbers?
So I think they were spending about $12 million a month, and I might be wrong on that. And that was from the Mueller report and some of the indictments related to the Mueller report. So it's outdated information.
Okay. How big is your staff?
A couple hundred. So they have about 200 people working in the America unit, which is also called the translation department. They also have a Ukraine unit and several other units. And then the other interesting thing that Russia does fairly often, so they've got this Internet Research Agency, which isn't even part of the government. It's run by an oligarch, Yevgeny Prigozhin, who is actually in the catering business of all things, but he funds this Internet Research Agency. They also work fairly frequently with criminal hacking organizations and other cyber criminals within the government. So rather, if they catch somebody who's committed a cyber crime, they basically give them a choice. Either you can rot in Russian jail, or you can help us with some of these crimes. And that also gives them an air of plausible deniability and some space between the actual cyber exploits and then what's going on inside the Russian government. So it's a very diffuse network. And I also would wager that there is more than one troll farm. We just haven't found the other ones yet, though the Internet Research Agency has been you know, one of the ones in the headlines because there have been many whistleblowers who have come out. They've been sloppy in some ways. So investigative journalists, including especially Russian investigative journalists, have done a lot of really important work identifying these campaigns. And I think it's only a matter of time before we find out the greater picture of how Russia has adapted to evade detection in 2020.
Now, if Russia was going to pass information or wish to pass techniques to people in America, would they be using Russian operatives inside of America? What's the number? So here's the question. How many Russian operatives do you think are actually in America? They don't need to be here to do what they're doing in Internet Research Agency, but what's your sense of that?
So in 2014 or 15, the Internet Research Agency did send a couple of people on kind of a reconnaissance mission to understand what life was like in swing states. They're listed in one of the indictments from the Russian investigation as well. And of course, Russia maintains a pretty robust intelligence service of agents who are under diplomatic cover. Again, I do not have numbers about how many of those people feed into the GRU activities, but actually with the Internet Research Agency, again, they're pretty separate from government. It's not like they're getting directions from the Kremlin. The way it is it's more like Putin has said, go mess things up in the United States. You have my endorsement, create havoc. And again, they are just testing out their narratives, throwing spaghetti at the wall and seeing what sticks. And they're able to do that because of the tools that social media provides. So they can have a lot of duds. And in fact, in 2016, or in the aftermath of 2016, when all of these ads came out, a lot of journalists were saying, you know, these ads actually don't look like they're that effective. There were some that were very, very effective, but some that weren't. And that's because Russia had the luxury of trying things out and seeing what worked. And when they did find a narrative that worked, they would keep sending that over and over and over. So it doesn't actually take a huge staff. It doesn't take that much reconnaissance. You need a basic knowledge of English, and then now with the internet, an ability to just monitor the news and trending topics in different countries and counties and vulnerable populations. It's pretty easy to do, and the tools that platforms like Facebook provide allow anyone to do that. You don't even need to have a degree in public relations or communications. Anybody with a Facebook account can do it.
So now the name itself, Internet Research Agency, goes to another point I'd like to ask about. It seems to me that the Russians are quite good at naming things the opposite of what they are. They use this, what I call 180-degree language technique. Well, they'll name something the opposite of what's really going on. The Internet Research Agency isn't really doing research on what the internet's all about. It's just the name for it. Can you talk to any other techniques they use, sort of best practices in Russian disinformation? Do they, in fact, try to name things the opposite of what they are? What do they do?
Often Russian names, to me at least, seem very bureaucratic. An internet research agency, especially in Russian, sounds that way to me. They're really good, though, at identifying those key hot button issues in society that are going to be the things that pit people against one another. So I think that's one thing they're very good at. And they're also good at picking up unwitting fellow travelers. So whether it's those freelance journalists, or I have an anecdote in my book about how a left-leaning protest group here in Washington that was creating a flash mob where they sang songs from the musical Les Miserables outside of the White House. It was kind of a silly protest on July 4th. They ended up being supported by the Internet Research Agency, who bought $80 worth of ads to promote that protest. And that's something that they're good at, identifying those groups and people that might be vulnerable, and using the techniques at their disposal in order to create more discord. The other thing I would say is that Russia's very good at adapting. So in every country that we've talked about, of course, the uniting factor is identifying those fissures and manipulating, amplifying them. But that fissure is different in every country. So in Estonia, it's an ethnic fissure. In Poland, they use historical fissures, religious kind of zealotism. They use issues with neighbors. In Ukraine, it's a neo-Nazi fascist narrative. There's also a lot of anti-LGBT rhetoric in both Ukraine and in Poland. And in the Czech Republic, it's anti-migrant rhetoric. Here, we've seen pro-gun rhetoric, anti-gun rhetoric, pro-Black Lives Matter, anti-Black Lives Matter, Blue Lives Matter. We see a variety of things, and they're very, very good at identifying those fissures and testing to see what works.
When you saw allegations and even some evidence of kind of penetration into the NRA by a Russian operative, talk to me about what you saw, what you observed. And she claims that she was just kind of an innocent advocate for gun rights in Russia as she sort of sallied up to NRA people in America. But it seemed to some of us that she was just a straight operative, and she was over here trying to work a fissure in American culture.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, the NRA has powerful friends in politics, so that was a very useful connection. So Maria Butina, the young woman who was a student at George Washington University, wormed her way into a lot of these pro-gun rights events. She was in contact with a Russian parliamentarian, Alexander Torshin. She, it seems, seduced one of the high-profile members that she was organizing things with that was a key to her getting access and things like that. And she even brought a delegation, if I'm not mistaken, from the NRA or related organizations over to Russia. And she said it was about, Russian-American friendship. But again, with a organization that is as powerful as the NRA and as connected as the NRA, meeting with an official government figure, even a parliamentarian, that definitely raises eyebrows. And she had, I believe, around the election, talked about setting up a back channel surrounding getting to President Trump so that, Russia could have more communications with him. And these influence vectors exist in other countries as well. So in the Republic of Georgia, rather than the NRA, it's through Orthodox Christian groups that's one of the shared features of both Georgia and Russia, quite Orthodox countries. So that Orthodox influence is the way that Russian influence makes its way into Georgia, which is staunchly anti-Russia because they're 20% occupied by the Russian Federation right now.
So whether it's a coincidence or not, there's an incredible high overlap between Republicans who are being influenced by Russians. Can you talk about the failing demographics of Russia and the failing demographics of, and I'm not trying to be political, I'm trying to be factual, the Republican Party, both of which seem to be having aging, failing, white, aging demographics?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I think the problem with the Republican Party right now is they seem to have lost their way, the morals that governed, Reagan Republican. Yeah, absolutely. I think in the Russia sphere, we often talk about Reagan just because of his role in negotiations with Gorbachev. But certainly Reagan Republicans and Reagan Democrats, for that matter, there were a lot of Polish Americans in particular who went over to the Republican Party because of Reagan's role in supporting solidarity and things like that. We were speaking about Lech Wałęsa before we started recording today. So I think the party has just lost its way, and it's become, rather than the defender of U.S. morals and values like they say they are, they've really they've just lost sight of those. They've lost that moral compass. And there used to be folks like Lindsey Graham, like Marco Rubio, who would go with people like John McCain to places like Ukraine to stand up for freedom and the right to self-determination. And you see them say that on the one hand, and yet on the other hand, they're supporting the president who has not been a friend to nations like Ukraine. And it's very sad. I don't think it's necessarily a demographic thing. I think it is a self-preservation and self-interest thing. And we should all be putting, the well-being of the country and the well-being of our allies ahead of that self-preservation, especially when it means the health of our democracy and other democracies.
So what would Russia's end game be? If everything happens the way they want it, give me the picture 4 years from now. What would be their ideal scenario?
I think the ideal scenario is a U.S. that is in gridlock, that is, less active on the world stage, America first, right? That is not entering into agreements or chastising those who are human rights offenders, who are, torturing and maiming people, who are using chemical weapons on people, who are breaking international law. Rather than standing up for all those international norms, we are too consumed by things at home. Our international status will have degraded even further. And that all of that, of course, is good for criminal regimes like the Kremlin.
So speaking of which, it seems to me that the Russians export mineral deposits, mostly oil, and crime. What do they actually export other than crime and corruption and mineral exports? And am I wrong in having that assessment of what they export?
Yeah, the Russian economy, I mean, there isn't much, and that's why sanctions, I think, have been fairly effective on Russia. The European Union sanctions, especially, they're one of the biggest, if not the biggest trading partner of Russia. So EU sanctions are really important. We can put sanctions on all we want, but the EU sanctions are the ones that really pack a punch. And that's why it's so unfortunate that the EU sanctions related to Ukraine have to be renewed basically every 6 months, and it's always up for debate. It's never certain. And that allows the Kremlin a lot of leverage on countries that are a bit more cozy with the Kremlin. So Italy, for instance. President Obama in that regard was right when he said Russia is a regional power. It's not a great power anymore. Certainly from the economic perspective, that is true. And that is what angered Putin to such a degree that we're in the situation that we are in today.
Speaking of Putin, for our viewers, give us a real quick a thumbnail background of Putin. You come from the Wilson Center. Woodrow Wilson, as you mentioned in the intro, was our only PhD president. Vladimir Putin is a former spy, coming up under Yeltsin, and some would say even basically undermining Yeltsin toward the end and exposing his alcoholistic tendencies. But one way or the other, he came up as a spy. So give us his thumbnail bio.
Yeah, he grew up in St. Petersburg in a pretty working class household, became a KGB agent and served in Dresden as the Berlin Wall was falling. And that was fairly influential for him. I think he refers to the fall of the Soviet Union as the greatest, catastrophe of his lifetime. And it's clear that he spent his career trying to return Russia to that greatness. After, in the early 90s, he served as deputy governor of St. Petersburg, deputy governor, I believe, and was actually fairly respected in that time. St. Petersburg was a pretty wild place during the 1990s, but he was a fairly unknown political figure outside of there. Really, nobody really knew who he was when Yeltsin appointed him his successor in 1999, famously on New Year's Eve, heading into the new millennium. And a lot of people thought he was going to be a Democrat early on. And the wars in Chechnya, which in many... Sorry?
Perestroika.
Yeah. Yep. And, he was seen as potentially a good leader until the atrocities and wars in places like Chechnya, terrorist attacks, killings of journalists, all these things started to happen more frequently. Of course, then we also saw the invasion of Georgia in 2008, the 5-day war there. So very quickly, it became clear that democracy in Russia was suffering. Rigged elections became a regular occurrence in Russia. And here we are today. I mean, I think the KGB background is an important thing to understand how it informed Putin's worldview and how he wants to cling to power. And he's just amended the constitution so that he can stay another 2 terms in office. So people my age have not seen very many other Russian presidents and may even, they're likely to outlive Putin, but a large portion of their life will be spent under Putin's rule.
Can you talk a bit about the process of compromise, how it works, how it's played as a tool by the KGB?
Sure. So the age-old trick of the security services is to bug either with video or even just sound, hotel rooms, have people followed, etc., to expose their indiscretions and use it as leverage over them. And I saw this happen with some of the activists I used to work with in Russia who, unfortunately, they would plant a camera in a hotel room and they were having illicit affairs or things like that. It's very nasty business, but the idea is to maintain leverage over an individual in an influential position or to denigrate them. Often it is used to denigrate women, especially. And it can be used in disinformation very simply. It's kind of like an old school hack, right? to denigrate an opponent or change the narrative about the opponent. And it's definitely still part of the toolkit of the Russian intelligence services.
So it seems I'm visualizing Putin leaning back on his desk with his feet up on the desk a year in, looking at review of things that went right that he likes. NATO is weakened, likes that. EU is weakened, likes that. Paris Accord weakened, he likes that. It seems like he's happy with disinformation campaigns in America that make us divided and having lots of problems with ourselves. He would also like Brexit, it seems to me. Brexit seems to me like it was Russian funded to begin with. Can you talk about the potential of Russian influence and creation, really, of the schism in Britain, which is Brexit?
So yeah, there is evidence that Russia targeted ads toward the British public around the Brexit campaign. There seems to have been some movement of Russian money toward major Tory donors during the Brexit campaign. But interestingly, the UK government, although they've actually done a really good job responding to disinformation in other ways because of how politicized the Brexit issue is, they've not done a full investigation into Russian interference in Brexit. So we don't have the wealth of information that was made public, for instance, during the Mueller report. So we can kind of only speculate on the bits that we do have to play with. But it is clear that they targeted anti-immigration messages, the Russians did, toward Brexit inclined voters. But again, I think my British friends would tell me, and I certainly agree with them, and I've spent a lot of time in the UK over the past 4 years, that again, it's not something that's created by Russia necessarily. These tendencies in British society were already there. They were amplified in order to pit people against one another. And absolutely, Brexit benefits Russia. If the UK is not in the EU, it means that they have to depend on countries like Russia a little bit more for things like investment. And we know that there's a lot of Russian money in the city of London in particular. And of course, the discord also benefits Russia in the long run.
And so while they use disinformation campaigns to like get their way, they do lots of big physical things too. It seems to me that they've been weaponizing immigration in multiple places, including in Syria. Couldn't it be seen that they would weaponize Syrian refugees to force them into Europe to cause a anti-libertarian or anti-liberal perspective inside of Europe and cause a sort of xenophobic isolation among the states of Europe?
100%. A lot of people think that Russia got involved in Syria, began its bombing campaigns there in order to increase that influx of migrants through Turkey and Greece into Europe. It's a very sad thing. I mean, I visited these refugee camps in 2016, and now, of course, we know one of the largest ones in Greece just burned down a couple of weeks ago. These people don't deserve to be used as pawns, but absolutely, the migrant crisis was one of the defining crises in informational, but also in the physical realm for the EU over the past 4 years. It really undermined Merkel, and there was a lot of disinformation surrounding it as well. So Russia played it on multiple fronts there.
So while disinformation is a term we're using now, 100 years ago, there was yellow journalism. All through the later 1800s, yellow journalism was used to fuel demagoguery in America and elsewhere where there was printed press. Talk to me about how much more powerful it is when in fact you can instantaneously with social media. It seems to me that the information wars are ways to use yellow journalism with a sort of political tone with instantaneous communication.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. It's not just the instantaneous communication, but the fact that it's traveling to exactly the people who are going to be most vulnerable to it, and they're not really seeing other information because they don't want to seek it out. And Facebook or other platforms are feeding them the content they know they're going to engage with. But in terms of the speed that it travels at, we just saw a couple of weeks ago with the protests in Kenosha, Wisconsin, and actually with the wildfires as well. Which in fact is probably even a better example. These narratives that anti-fascist organizations were setting, or Black Lives Matter were setting the fires, absolutely took off all over Facebook to the extent that emergency services were being diverted to investigate the calls of people being arsonists more than they were actually fighting the fires. And so many of my colleagues who study domestic disinformation more than I do have called for a circuit breaker for the internet, very similar to how it works on the stock market, where if something is being traded very heavily or taking a nosedive, you can hit that circuit breaker and stop the content, in this case, from being shared in order to protect public safety, public health, or perhaps an election. And the social media platforms are starting to think in that direction. I think they're starting to understand the impact, but imagine if they had done that ahead of 2016. Imagine if they had done that even early after the election. Instead, what we had was Mark Zuckerberg saying he thought it was a kind of crazy idea to suggest that Facebook had influenced the election. And it's very clear, not only did it influence the election, it influences behavior on a daily basis. That's what we're seeing during the COVID-19 crisis.
So phony photographs and phony videos, people who've got the ability to quickly edit a video to do something to make it look like, to misrepresent what really happened. We saw Nancy Pelosi speaking kind of slowly, when in reality that was a modified video. So we got an election, we have some debates coming up just before the election. So what should we be looking out for in terms of dis and misinformation at and during the debates, just in front of this election?
Well, with regard to manipulated media and video, it's something that can be very difficult to detect with the naked eye. And the things that we've seen so far, including the Pelosi video, including some of the other examples, there was one of a reporter, I think, that the right claimed that he was pushing an intern at a press briefing or something like that. It's hard to tell unless you're an expert if they've been manipulated. So there's an effort by Twitter and by Adobe, which makes the software that a lot of the editing is done through, and as well as the New York Times. They're all in this project together called the News Provenance Project, which labels manipulated media as they're able to find it. And it will also allow Adobe users to see the edits that have been made to images and video. It's not fully operational yet, but I think it's a really good effort. It's anticipating what we're going to see, which normally we don't see proactive engagement like that from tech companies, but it also is empowering users with information. So it's not going to say, you know, no media should be manipulated. There's lots of perfectly legitimate manipulations of media. You know, you're going to up the contrast or the saturation on a photo, things like that. There's reasons to edit video, of course. But it will be able to show you the steps that an image or a video has gone under in order to determine whether that editing is legitimate or not. And if people wish to look up the edit history, they'll be able to do that. So I'm really looking forward to that coming online. But I would say ahead of the election, just be very careful about the video and image content that you're sharing, and understand, especially for images, it's really easy to do what I talked about before, that reverse image search, and you can find explainers on how to do it everywhere online. But that's a great way to see the original provenance of an image. It won't show you if it's been edited, but it does show you where it came from on the internet. And I think that can offer a lot of clues for users. But in general, just think before you share. That's what I can implore you to do.
What about the potential of real-time fact-checking by an alliance of fact-checking that could be on the screen like a little score down in the corner as someone is speaking? During the upcoming debates, it might be helpful if an alliance of fact-checkers could basically keep a kind of a red hot or green yes or no consensus of fact-checkers say X or Y statement is true.
Yeah, the Brits did something like that during their general election. And then the Tory party actually used it to kind of a political advantage. So they changed the Tory party Twitter account to look like it was a fact-checking account, and used it in ways that I think were incredibly misleading. If the debates, like the presidential commission on presidential debates, were to set that up, I think it might be good. But there are also people who just won't be swayed by that. They already think fact checkers are part of the deep state. And to some degree, there's certain research that says if you fact check something, people are actually more likely to remember the incorrect version than the correct version. It's just the way that our brains work. So in terms of the utility, I'm not sure that it would work. And also the way that the debates work, unfortunately, is that the candidates have okays over everything and they have to agree to it. And I just don't foresee President Trump agreeing to being fact-checked live.
So explain to our readers about RT and Russia's recycled name, Sputnik. They've recycled that name, one of their famous successes, to some benefit to them. So explain what RT does and what Sputnik is.
Sure. So RT is Russia's answer to international media. Think like Al Jazeera or the BBC. Basically, it was originally founded as Russia Today, and then they realized with Russia in the title, people were less likely to watch it, so they rebranded as RT. And they are a network that covers the news, so they say from a Russian perspective. Their question is, or their motto is "Question More," which I think is hilarious. And it's interesting the way that they got their
Talked earlier about the way they name things.
yeah.
Name things at 180 degrees of truth, it seems to me. But anyway, okay,
Yeah.
RT.
So they got their start. Well, it was founded in 2005, but really they sunk more money into it after the Georgia War in 2008, because the editor-in-chief of RT, Margarita Simeonan, said that she felt that Russia looked so pale in comparison to the Georgians, who had English-speaking officials who were on CNN all the time. Mikhail Saakashvili went to school at Columbia. I mean, he's very flamboyant and knows how to speak to an American audience. And that's how a lot of the other Georgian officials were as well. So Margarita Simeonan said, we're going to invest in this station. And they really gained trust through a couple of interesting moments in the United States. On YouTube, they started buying the rights to disaster footage, so tsunamis, earthquakes, things like this. They would also lift footage of like cute cat videos or the homeless man with a golden voice. And if you look at their YouTube page, that's their top 10 videos. It's nothing that has to do with the news. But that's how they built trust, because people would see the RT logo in the corner and they would say, huh, okay, it's that RT, right? I remember watching that kitten video from there. But they also did coverage of things like the Occupy Wall Street movement, which at the time, many people in the United States might have said that that wasn't getting enough coverage on the US airwaves. And so people turned to it. And at that point, it wasn't as much disinformation and propaganda as it is now. So again, they built that trust. And then over time, it's gradually just turned into absolutely fact-free reporting. And it's a pretty, I would say it's powerful, but we shouldn't overstate its power. Again, because it's, you might see it on a hotel TV or in an elevator somewhere, but it's not like millions upon millions of people are tuning into it. Their internet views, again, are mostly concentrated on these kind of disaster porn and cat videos. So I don't think it's as potent of a weapon. And then Sputnik is just the online version. It just does print articles, and they also have radio stations in some places. But again, they're a clear arm of the Russian government that is editorially not independent. They're dependent on the Russian editorial line.
Another previous speaker spoke and showed his movie that won an Oscar, in fact, called Icarus, about the Russian doping scandal in the Olympics, and how the Russians it was a state-run program. It wasn't a small program, it was a big state-run program. Yeah. So if effectively the Russians use doping to sort of like phony up the results in the Olympics, and if they use RT to try to phony up news, ultimately, if they succeed in undermining America, essentially what they get out of it, they get to be a bigger piece of an overall smaller pie. What's the goal there?
Again, I think it's about asserting that Russian greatness, which has been elusive for the Russian Federation since the Soviet Union fell. And I think that's what we see with, the doping scandal. That's what we see with Russia's flaunting of international law, whether it's, annexing Crimea, involvement in Syria, or the poisoning of Sergei Skripal and his daughter Yulia in the UK. It's about flexing the Russian muscle and showing that they mean business.
Was that doping done deliberately with and only could have come from Russian government poison, so that they could essentially flaunt, we can do this, you can't prove it, but obviously we're the ones who did it? They could have, if they really want to shoot the guy, they could kill him. But talk to us about the difference about this technique versus just assassinating somebody. What do they get out of it doing it this way?
I think they likely meant to kill him, and they almost did. He was in a coma for a very long time. They've also just poisoned the leading opposition figure, Alexei Navalny, with a similar poison in Russia. That looks like it was also botched. So this is an interesting kind of trend in the Russian security services and others. If you've not ever encountered Bellingcat, the open source investigative team. They do a lot of work surrounding the Skripals and the poisoning of Navalny, but they've been able to track down the intelligence agents that have been involved with it. Especially in the UK situation, they were very sloppy about what they did, and the open source evidence is overwhelming that it was Russia. That being said, you know, there have been a lot of other instances where the open source evidence is overwhelming and Russia still won't admit to it. But I think, you know, we think of these Russian spy agencies as, you know, formidable, but the best thing that we can do is actually think about them as fairly bumbling these days, because they keep on messing up. And that, you know, also works against Putin, which we like.
Right. So we talked about them weaponizing immigrants, but there's another big trend that I'm a little bit concerned about. I wonder about. It seems to me, just a thesis, it seems to me that Russia benefits from global warming and sea level rise. Russia is 350 feet above sea level, 800 miles from the shoreline, and most of the world is coastal. And essentially, if you rise the sea 20 feet, New York's in trouble, DC's in trouble, Hong Kong's in trouble, Tokyo's in trouble. Most of the world, Mumbai is gone. Most of the world is in lots of trouble, but Russia benefits because also the northern Urals could become farmlands, which now permafrost covered mineral deposits become more accessible. And their northern Arctic shoreline could, for the first time, provide them with deep water ports with very short shipping routes to the rest of the world. They don't go around, they go just straight down to where they want to go. So what to this thesis that your questioner is asking about, this concept that I have that Russia actually isn't against, but utterly benefits from global warming and sea level rise?
Yeah, I don't know as much about all of that, but I do know that Russia has been fairly antagonistic in the Arctic, especially for the past, well, for all time. There are often, you know, tiffs between icebreakers and things in the Arctic, and they've been trying to shore up their Arctic sea shipping routes for a long time. So in that case, it makes perfect sense to me. Russia also, you know, is a country that is not really into environmentalism to the same degree as many other countries, because frankly, most of its population is still very concerned about, you know, feeding their families and keeping a roof over their heads. It's not, they don't have the luxury of thinking about those other things. So I think it's a combination of those two.
So I read somewhere that Rex Tillerson got the highest Russian award of a private individual handed to him personally by Putin, and that the largest contract in the world in history was the $500 billion Exxon contract for mineral exploitation in Russia. Are you familiar with those two facts? I think they're facts.
I knew that he received the Order of Friendship, and yeah, he had a very close relationship. I mean, I think that's one of the reasons he was appointed as Secretary of State, his close relationship with the Russian government, his understanding of Russia. But to his credit, Rex Tillerson did kind of go down in flames for standing up for himself. So
yeah, bravo to that as well. So is it your thesis that in fact there are people in the US government who are controlled by Russia, basically that they're compromised or otherwise? What's your belief there?
So I don't actually have, I don't believe that. I've not seen any evidence that that is the case, that there is some massive compromise on Trump. It seems like what was described in the Steele dossier, some of that was faulty intelligence. But I don't think that the Russians need compromise on Trump or the Trump family or Trump enterprise in order to affect how the president and his coterie is behaving, because Trump has and continues to have and will continue to have business interests in the former Soviet Union. And Putin is in a great position to hook him up, whether it's with the Miss Universe pageant or Trump Tower in Moscow in the future or anything like that. Frankly, I also think he craves the admiration of people like Putin. I mean, look at how he behaves with Kim Jong-un, and he doesn't have business interests there, right? So I think he admires Putin. He's openly admitted that. And when you admire someone and you're trying to impress them, you don't need to do very much in terms of, they don't need to have very much on you, because you are working to impress them and meet those goals. So yeah, I just hesitate to say that anyone in particular is turned or something like that. But I do think in addition to all of that about Trump's psyche, there are also people around him, or used to be people around him, like Paul Manafort, who had active links to Russian intelligence, whether he knew it or not. I gather that he probably did. I assume that he did through Konstantin Kilimnik.
Mhm.
And those are the people that influence the policy. But again, not a compromise situation. Paul Manafort was a very self-interested individual, as we learned during his trial.
So Nina, it's been terrific spending time with you at the Wednesday Yachting Luncheon. We very much appreciate your scholarship and the thoroughness with which you've researched all the disinformation data points that are inside your book. And we wish you much success as a disinformation fellow. I couldn't find another person who got the title.
Yes, I'm very lucky.
Did you pick that disinformation title? How did that happen?
It came to me. I would have perhaps suggested counter disinformation or something like that. Like I'm propagating disinformation, but yes, it's a fun title.
Well, good luck with the book, and thank you very much for being our guest. And with that, the Wednesday Yachting Luncheon is adjourned.